Is this on? Yes. Welcome, everyone, to this panel discussion called Squaring the Politics, exploring the World Bank's theory of change for working in fragile and conflict-affected situations. My name is Olivier Ray. I head the French Development Agency's Conflict and Fragility Unit. And I've been asked to moderate this panel. And one of the reasons why I've gladly accepted to do so is that as a development bank, AFD faces the same challenges on many of these issues. And I wanted to start by thanking Elizabeth Drew for setting up, of International Alerts, for setting up this event and making my job as moderator easy because she neatly laid out this session. Unfortunately, she couldn't make it today because she's stuck in London due to visa issues. It's good to know that with new visa regulations, if you go to Sudan, you can't get a waiver, even if you're of British nationality. But so we're very disappointed that Elizabeth couldn't make it today, but luckily Julian accepted to step in. So we've heard very strong commitments this week on the FCV agenda, starting with the World Bank president, who spoke of the urgent necessity to transcend the humanitarian development divide. He said that tackling the root causes of violence had become a key priority for the World Bank Group. We also heard a lot of speak about agility and greater flexibility in order to operate in situations of crises. And he said that the World Bank Group is no longer thinking that the development starts after the fact that the humanitarian community has done the job. On the contrary, we need to come in very early on in crises. So it's a sort of language that we wouldn't necessarily have heard 5 or 10 years ago. And the reason why I'm excited to have this session today is that we hope to get a better understanding of why it remains so difficult, despite this very strong commitment to do a better job, to interconnect the way we work, to work in these contexts, and for development institutions to achieve significant impact. Is it due to the difficulty of squaring the politics, i.e. as development actors to actually engage in situations where politics strongly matters? Is it because we have the wrong theories of change? Is it because our incentive structures in development banks are not adapted to working in these environments? Is it because of the inertia of prevailing models that exist in our given bureaucratic cultures? So some of the questions we'll be trying to address in this panel is what are the bank's assumptions about what works and what doesn't in trying to address fragility? Do they hold? And if not, do they need to change? Secondly, how does the World Bank reconcile being an apolitical institution with the fact that it needs to work in inherently politicized environments? And how can that be negotiated in contexts where the bank is actually dealing with illegitimate or governments that don't have popular support, or when it needs to deal with actors that are actually trying to close down civic space? Third set of questions, how can partnership actually help in negotiating this very political space? So I want to ask the panelists to make inroads in the political economy of our own donor institutions and how that political economy can be navigated to do a better job at tackling the issues that we've been discussing this week. So we have an hour and a half. The initial panel discussion is going to take us about 40 minutes, which should leave us 50 minutes for an interactive session. Will Haynes, who's a team leader for the conflict team in Chase, has accepted to offer opening remarks, and then we'll move on to Alexander Mark, and I'll be presenting the panelists as we go. Will?
Thank you. It's all right. It's fine. Thank you very much. Good. So I'm glad you said that, because I was going to start with a couple of comments on DFID in this session about the bank and about political economy in DFID. So the bit of DFID that I work in is the Conflict and Humanitarian Department, CHASE, which many of you will be familiar with. And I think it's probably fair to say that 3 or 4 years ago, CHASE was the bit of DFID that did conflict. And it did an okay job at that, but I think that kind of let the rest of the organisation in some ways get on with the day job. And that was an arrangement that worked very well for parts of the organisation and worked very well for DFID delivering its wider commitments. But I think there was some real problems with that around the way that we approached issues of fragility and conflict. And I think that has changed quite dramatically within the last couple of years, and particularly with some of the publications that we made last year, that the UK government put out last year. We published a Strategic Defence and Security Review last November. We published a UK ODA strategy at the same time. And we've actually just published a departmental plan for DFID at the same time as all UK government departments have done. And the thing that they really have in common is putting DFID right in the middle of UK objectives around building long-term stability overseas. And they put objectives around peace and security right at the top of the list of things that DFID does. So we're in a position now where I think what CHASE does is not the conflict bit of DFID. What CHASE does is helping the rest of the organisation to meet those commitments. And that is, that's quite a significant change, and it's one that we're feeling through the way that the organisation works, and one that we're still getting to grips with. But I'm aware that that is not a situation which is unique to the UK. It's one which is being felt in a lot of other organisations as well, and it's really one which has been clear this week. I think what's also clear this week is that in a lot of ways the World Bank is providing some really, really valuable leadership on a lot of these issues. And it has done since the World Development Report of 2011 and previously, and I think that still makes a lot of the intellectual running on these issues around what stability means and what we as development actors can do towards it. And events like this are, well, certainly the best opportunity that we have in the year, I think, to get together and have some of these conversations. So we hugely welcome that. And there are lots of good examples of the bank working very effectively to address fragility, and Debbie's going to talk about some of the examples in the Middle East, but there are many others. But I don't think anybody will think I'm being too rude to say that we are yet to see that fully taken into account through the bank's operations everywhere. And one of the things that we are really emphasising through the IDA 18 negotiations and the forward look process is about how the bank can not just do more on conflict and in fragile states, but how it can do it better and differently. And it's the how part of that equation as well as the how much, which is really important and which risks being a bit underemphasised. I think with a lot of this, there's a risk sometimes that what we end up talking about is just doing development in fragile states, rather than what we can do to contribute towards building stability. And actually, that's just a recipe for doing some really expensive and really high-risk programs. It's not a recipe for addressing the causes and the drivers of conflict. So the kind of conversations we're having around that in DFID, just to give you a flavour of those and how that relates to the conversations here, means thinking about how we understand fragility. We've talked about that a lot this week. It's not just about poverty, not just about state capacity, but about how people perceive authority and about how how global and regional issues affect communities. It's about working in a way which might be more flexible and more responsive than we used to. And in fragile states, I think sometimes we need to be clear about where we're going, but be really prepared to change our minds and our assumptions about how we're going to get there. And that brings some costs and some ways of working which are different to more kind of established, more less flexible ways of programming. And I think we probably recognised above everything else that fragility is about politics. And that's a message which has come through really strongly through a lot of work in DFID in the last couple of years, and from country analysis through to a whole range of policy conversations. But I think that kind of headline is pretty much accepted. What that doesn't mean is that we all have to be politicians. I don't think it means either that we all have to be diplomats, rather than development experts. We can keep doing what we're good at, but it does mean that we all, including DFID, including the bank, have to understand how our actions affect the politics in the places where we're working, and how all those actions can work to promote systems for peaceful change rather than worsening processes of exclusion, which is absolutely a risk in a lot of those contexts. And I think that's particularly true for an organisation like the bank, which works with national governments as clients. I think that makes it more the case rather than less. So I think from my point of view, this is a really useful session to think about working through some of those challenges together, and for us to talk about how we want to see all the organisations that we work with, including the World Bank, including the bits of the UN that are represented here, including organisations like International Alert, all of whom have really complementary strengths and can collaborate on answering some of those difficult challenges. And great to have this discussion today to unpack some of those obstacles and opportunities, and to think about practical steps forward.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Does this one work? Yes. Alexandre Marc, you're Chief Technical Specialist within the Fragility, Conflict and Violence Unit at the World Bank. You have over 2 decades of experience in working in areas in conflict or around conflict throughout the world. And at the bank, you led the social cohesion and violence prevention program. You were also sector manager for social development in the Europe and Central Asia region. So you know the bank inside out. Your job today is to accompany this change on issues of fragility, conflict, and violence. So Will just said that fragility is about politics. How can the bank as a development institution deal with the politics of the context that you're involved in? And the second set of questions is around theories of change. We've heard very disturbing messages this week on the relation between growth and peace, which isn't as linear as we would have expected a few years ago. We've heard disturbing messages on service delivery, which isn't necessarily the best way or the only way to legitimize government. Sometimes it goes the other way. More jobs doesn't equal less violent context or less violent youth. So what are the unhelpful assumptions that the World Bank can make in some of its work in FCV contexts, and why does it matter to defeat some of them? And if we're defeating some of these assumptions, do we not risk throwing the baby out with the bath water? 7 minutes.
Okay, well, this is a really, really big topic. So let me maybe start. You know, we had a session on the WDR. I mean, if there's the one document that is establishing some elements of our theory of change, this is this document. The only problem is that those WDR are sort of broad policy documents. They're not how-to documents. And I think the big problem after the WDR is we haven't sufficiently, despite all the try we've made, is to think about the how-to and what the how-to means for an institution like the World Bank. And I think that's the core issue. But the main message is you don't do the same development policy. You don't achieve poverty reduction and shared prosperity in the same way when a country is fragile and a country is not. And that's a sort of message that have not yet totally percolated the institution. It's a different thing you're doing. A lot is a matter of phasing, but another matter is really priority in why do you invest and how do you invest. And these debates come again and again, again and again, each time you sort of start to intervene in a country, right? So, you know, in Mali there was a big debate, and Mali is doing great things now, but in Mali there was a great debate. Should the bank go where the majority of the poor are, which is in the south, and let the place where there's less poor and more political problem, which is the north, to others? And of course then you pose the question, but that's not what the WDR tells you, but it has a logic, right? The only problem with this logic, if the north collapse, the poor in the south will not become less poor, because the whole country will be affected. So therefore, there are trade-offs, and we need to admit that there are a lot of activity you will do that will not have the immediate impact on poverty and immediate impact on shared prosperity that are essential so that you can have the long-term benefit for poverty and shared prosperity. And this is what you were referring by stability, peace building, other activities. financing regions where the rate of return is much lower than others, getting in area of low-density population where actually you're not going to have huge impact on the growth level. These are all really important, but those trade-offs needs to be done in a relatively structured way, and it does not happen often. So now to come back to the two issues that I think the WDR have talked, I mean, they talked about many issues, but one was institutions, which are really clearly central. And I was mentioning that institution, we said we were doing capacity building, but the WDR tell us we have to mostly work on legitimacy first, and we don't really know how to build legitimacy in institution. The second thing is how we deal with the politics. And you were mentioning that. And I think the politics is a problem, as you said it very, very rightly in the problem, it's a problem of understanding what politics is and how you do politics. And there are many, many things on the politics that I would think are actually very much in the realm of the World Bank. So of course we should not say, you know, and which we did sometimes in the past, but we should really not do it, is to say, you know, we prefer to work with this party than with this party, right? Or we prefer to have this president re-elected than this one. That's certainly not what the bank is about. But there are a lot of things of saying, why isn't this sub-region more on the agenda of the government? Even if this sub-region might be more sympathetic to the opposition, because we're not looking at the opposition, but we're really looking at what does do for development. So this will be perceived as politics, but it's really, at the end, a question about economic development, about effectiveness of development. And that's the sort of politics that we have to be in. You know, in Burundi, when the local government structure that were very elaborate going down were starting to be politicized by the party, by putting everybody there and trying to have cells of the party at every level, it's right for the bank to go and say, I'm sorry, but that's not the right way to do. Those people are resolving technical question and not political question, and I think we have a pure right to go there and say that's not the right way to do it, right? So there are many, many things that we can that we can do there. The other answer to this politics is around governance, and obviously every aspect of governance has a very strong political element. And when you say, you know, you don't have the right sort of ways to get information coming into your decision making, you don't have enough voice of citizens there. This is also politics, but this is the politics that the bank is already in and needs to be even more in. And the third thing that we haven't done enough is to be able to really partner very strongly with the UN, with other organizations that have a much stronger mandate on politics, where I think we can do the most, and because we just did some work on stability in West Africa, is, for example, work with organizations like ECOWAS. ECOWAS has done very impressive work in West Africa in dealing directly with the politics because they could, not because they're very effective, but because the presidents that are members of ECOWAS don't want a return, going back on the democratic, on the big improvement of democracy that have happened in this region. So you immediately see a big mobilization on third-term issues, on others. And we need to work with ECOWAS on that much, much closer, and we did, for example, in Guinea-Bissau. But that's what I would call the realm of politics. My last word on that is that the bank does not prepare its staff to do those things. So there's zero training. You can go in a place where a director would come from a place where things are very straightforward, you know, a country where it's very straightforward, move to a country where all the dialogue should do around this politics, zero training. Zero training. Well, of course, many directors are really interested and they will try to find a way and all that. But that's, for me, a real problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have a World Bank director with us today, who can tell us about what
Talking about me?
No, no, no.
how do you square
You're
the
the
politics.
exception, because you've been trained for that.
So Deborah Wetzel, you're Director of Strategy and Operations within MENA, Middle East and North Africa Vice Presidency at the World Bank. You were previously Country Director for Brazil. You've been Director for Governance and Public Sector in the PREM network. And so you have experience in fragile and less fragile context. Obviously, conflict is a primary feature of the MENA region in today's context. The World Bank's new MENA strategies is actually very inspiring, very bold in many ways. It actually recognizes the World Bank's role in building peace. Yet the World Bank, and we've started to see this in the discussion, has institutional structures and incentives that restricts its ability to work strategically and effectively in some of these tough environments. So how do you think the World Bank could work differently to better support peace in the MENA regions? And what are the current constraints that you face to do a better job? And perhaps some of the opportunities that the MENA Vice Presidency will want to seize in the coming months? And aren't there risks for the World Bank to take too much of a political role if we're going in that direction?
Okay, so all in 7 minutes, everyone. So thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel. I think what we're doing in the MENA region is an actual theory of change in practice. So I'll talk a little bit about where we were coming from, where we are right now, some of the operational aspects of that. So I'll talk a little bit about the substance first, and then talk a little bit about the operational. And there's lots of challenges. We'll see how much of the 7 minutes I have left, but we can always come back to that. So when the Arab Spring started back in 2010, 2011, our reference point was really the transition that occurred in ECA, the Europe and Central Asia, when the wall came down. And so we thought very much that what we needed to do was just sort of get out of the way and let things happen. And as we've seen over the past 5-6 years, that the transition in this region has been quite different than what occurred in the Europe and Central Asia region. We've seen the cycle of growth, the cycles of violence, the refugees, and we see how this has had and generated a lot of global issues and global spillover effects. And our approach to that prior to this strategy was very much a traditional World Bank approach, which was, well, if there's conflict, then we need to work around the edges of conflict. That our role was, as a development institution, was not to dive into the conflict that involved politics. We had the blue helmets in there. It was not really what we were meant to be doing, but when we had an opportunity to engage and try to promote development, we should do so. But when my new boss came along and joined the bank, Hafez Ghanem, some of you may know him, we stepped back and had a look at it. And in the end, we decided to turn that whole discussion upside down. And so our strategy now, we basically have said, no, we can't avoid conflict. What we really need to do is focus on the issues that are driving conflict and instability. Because until we do that, you're never going to get peace and stability and development in the longer term. And this created quite a kerfuffle, lots of jokes about how, what our objective is, will we attain world peace, Nobel Prizes, all that kind of thing. But actually the key bit of it is focus on these issues of social and economic inclusion in order to promote peace and stability, which in turn then promotes development. So the key issue, we are diagnostic that most of you, or some of you may have seen, but also everyone's pointing to these issues of, what's driving violent extremism? What does that mean in terms of what we might be able to do? And we looked at that and then we said, well, inclusion is a real issue. So we then set out a new strategy, which is really focused on this issue of economic and social inclusion. And it has 4 pillars that I'll just go through very quickly. The first pillar is quite new and interesting for the bank. It's the notion that we need to help change the social contract in the Middle East and North Africa. And basically, this refers to an old model of governing with lots of subsidies for education, health, bread, energy, et cetera, and jobs for citizens. But in return for that, compliance or a state and citizens that are not very aggressive, that they sit tight with that. That model had run its course. It's also about strengthening citizen engagement. So it's getting the government to think about what its proper role should be. How do we build in citizen engagement? How do we build in inclusion? Inclusion through service delivery, so better services to everyone in the population, just not the top end. How do we help promote the private sector? How do we get the government out of places where it shouldn't be and pull in the private sector in order to create jobs for all those youth that are running around that don't have hope, that don't have jobs, that don't have opportunities? So that's what that first pillar is all about, a lot of things in that. The second pillar is about regional cooperation, and not regional integration, but cooperation. How can we bring governments around some of these critical public issues? We're focusing on water, energy, and education, which are hotspot topics for the entire region. And the idea goes back all the way to the European community of coal and steel. So when these things started happening in the region, there were no structures really to help guide and lay down ways for people to talk to each other. So the idea is if we can take a few pragmatic things for which people need solutions and just get them around a table to start talking about it and solving some of these regional problems, that may help the way in which these countries interact, knowing full well that the dynamics of the politics and the sectoral splits and all, there's lots and lots of stuff going on, but practical things may be able to move us forward. The third pillar those first two pillars are all about the causes of conflict. And so this is also driven by our WDR. So causes of conflict, those first two, and then we're turning to looking at the consequences of conflict. And so the third pillar of the strategy is about helping communities strengthen resilience in the face of the refugees. So Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq has enormous numbers of displaced people. Djibouti is part of our little world, so Yemen has a lot of refugees. And most of these host communities are providing public goods in a way. They're dealing with the spillover effects of conflicts, and we as an institution haven't until now been very effective at dealing with that. So we're very focused on trying to bridge the responses with the humanitarian and development. These are longer-term issues. So helping refugees, giving them, water and bread and food, and that's part of the solution. But these people also need jobs, they need education, they need hope, they need dignity. And the way they're being treated now is, so working with the host communities, supporting them to be able to address some of these issues. We're very, very actively involved in this right now with a whole bunch of partners. And I'll come to a second part of that in a moment. And then the fourth pillar of this strategy is reconstruction and recovery. So how can we be planning now for a future? We don't know when it's going to be, but we hope eventually it will happen, whether it's in Syria, Yemen, elsewhere, that we will need to reconstruct. And again, this goes back to the very roots of our own institution, IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It was created in 1944. It didn't actually open its doors till 1946, but we were thinking about how do we reconstruct the post-war Europe. And so we're now thinking we need to start now, and with many, many partners, UN, EU, various agencies, we're doing dynamic needs assessments and using new technology and trying to think about that. So that's sort of the broad outline. I have a couple minutes left. So how are we operationalizing this? So in the work we do with our strategy, we look at each country program and we are drawing a straight line of sight. Are the things we're doing on the ground contributing to this strategy? Are we funding things that are the right things for the government to be doing? Are we sustaining old-style oligopolistic structures that prevent private sector activity and things that will lead to jobs? We have a whole set of questions and frameworks that when we look at our strategies and country programs, how do we make sure that when we're reducing subsidies that the government is providing now. We're creating conditional cash transfers and other social protection systems that help the poor as opposed to the rich. How do we make sure that the poor are included in service delivery? So a whole range of filters that we're looking at. Second big shift in what we're doing is a very strong focus on this issue of public goods, global and regional public goods. How can we help countries in this region? How can we be a convener in the international community to help create dynamic around these addressing and supporting countries in delivering public goods? And that has led us to a very strong engagement on the partnership front. We have a very, very close partnership with the Islamic Development Bank. We're working closely with them and the UN on a new financing facility to create new tools. Most of our countries are middle-income countries, so they are not entitled, so to speak, to concessional finance, but we need to find a way to help fund in a concessional manner all of the public support that these countries are providing to the world. Third operational question is, what kind of instruments might we use? In the old world, we tended to focus quite a lot on smallish investment type projects to give very focused and specific help to communities. Now we are stepping back and looking at some of the broader policy issues. DPLs are very controversial. We've just done 2 huge DPLs, one in Iraq, one in Egypt, to try to help them create the new framework for this new social contract. It's leading to things like reductions in energy subsidies, but protections of, building up social protection schemes, looking at transparency, looking at a whole, building in citizen engagement, a whole set of other things. So we're looking at all the instruments we have, creating new instruments, thinking about how to address these things. Finally, there's a number of areas where we're going to focus less on. So this issue of short-term gains versus the longer-term development issues that we need to address. We're trying to shift a little bit more our interactions to the longer term. That's difficult because our partners are governors, right? Governments particularly, but we're trying to pull in civil society and think about citizens as well as governments as being our clients. Also focusing very quickly or specifically on keeping the public sector focused on things that it does well, as opposed to controlling, supporting vested interests and having a lock on some of these economic issues that prevents smaller entities, others from advancing, developing the economy and developing jobs. Let me stop there, and questions, I can take any questions during the...
And it's going to be very interesting to get back to the operationalization of it and how that has started to translate in the bank's portfolio in the region. Now, Debbie mentioned partnership as a key element of the new MENA strategy. Iago Salmon, you're actually in charge of the UN World Bank partnership within the UN Peacebuilding Support Office. So this is your daily job. Can strategic collaboration with UN agencies help the World Bank navigate some of the politics of these contexts? And how do you go about integrating politics as a development actor? You worked for a long time for UNDP as a governance advisor. You worked in Sudan, in Geneva, and in New York. So you know some of that internal politics within big structures. What's your understanding of the main obstacles in making this partnership more systematic? We heard in one session that, coming actually from a World Bank colleague, that the UN World Bank partnership was key in moving forward, but it remained a bit ad hoc and it needed to be made more systematic. What's your take on this issue?
Thank you. And just noting the internal politics, I don't work for PBSO. I work for the different pillars of the UN, so across the peacekeeping, political affairs, development agencies. Just an important caveat. I was actually very excited about this session, and I'm not Oscar, as obvious. Oscar is actually traveling to West Africa next week, and in his background notes is actually the study that the bank developed. So you are already beginning to see how cross-fertilization might work. And he's looking at the longer-term concerns over transition and fragility in West Africa, because the attention is not there right now. And yet we're going through a series of complex transitions, peacekeeping missions on their way out, very, very low commodity prices. The borders are still essentially porous, and we want to try and bring some attention back to those issues. The reason I was excited about this session was there's a lot of conversation, a lot of focus at a very senior level on the operational reforms the bank is making. And Will highlighted this and sort of the move towards doing more development in fragile states, not necessarily addressing the drivers of fragility. I think the theory of change there is a key piece. And I'm very happy to hear that that's clearly already happening, because the bank is already talking about stability, security, inclusion, social contracts, and I feel more and more that I'm back in the UN. Actually, it's an interesting, and it's not entirely facetious point. The UN is often accused of being a heavily normative organization. The reason being is because the closer you get to the politics, the norms are your Virgil that guide you through the complexity, and so we take our norms to heart, because they're the pieces that let us see how to get out of the complexity and back towards a greater good, which is why the World Humanitarian Summit report is our humanity. It's elevated to that level. We must remember our common humanity, because that's what will guide us beyond the technicalities. On the theory of change, I wanted to just add a couple of points, and then I'll say a point about partnerships. And I'll do it very, very quickly. And I'd written on my sheet sort of integrate politics into development models, but actually what I really want to say is integrate a theory of violence into development models. The bank has developed truly well-evolved understandings of politics and political economy in particular, not politics, but political economy, and how it impacts upon development programming. But violence as a social phenomenon is a very different animal. As a direct threat, it shortens time horizons, it distorts all other incentive factors, and it is, in many of the fragile states we're talking about, the primary currency of patronage. Your ability to provide security or remove that security devalues any other form of rent that you may be able to provide. And it's a key aspect of moving from working from fragility to also working on conflict. And this is one of the bits of the theories of change. One of the big differences is that more and more we're not just talking about fragile states, we're talking about states caught in the throes of extremely violent, devastating conflict, and exiting from that requires also looking at conflict as a violence, as a factor. But I won't go into that too much. The other one, which is linked into this, is on a theory of change. Is the UN did some work 2-3 years ago looking across all of our governance programming in post-conflict societies and asking what we needed to look at better. And we came up with very unsatisfying answers, because we kept looking at sectoral programs. And then we realized that what was missing actually was this entire piece around the social contract. And the problem was we keep having programs that reach sectoral objectives, but they lose the outcome. They lose the South Sudan, frankly, or they lose the Yemen. And what's needed is beyond the sectoral, the vertical planning and the vertical resourcing and the vertical TA is horizontal plans that connect these pieces together. And they can be as simple as a strategic communications package in the Prime Minister's office in Somalia. Every time there's a Shabab attack in Somalia, 2 weeks later, there is a fantastic piece of communication talking about traffic lights in Mogadishu, or post boxes opening up in Baidoa. And this is strategic communication. This is saying let's not just focus all of our attention on Shabab. This is not the story. This is not the narrative. They're not an existential threat to the federal government. It could be as complicated as a 20,000 or 22,000 troop peacekeeping mission with all of the international law and authority and complexity that brings. But these are horizontal variables that come into any sectoral programs. And what we, on the bank's theory of change, is to sort of lift the bank, if we can ask that, sort of beyond the project to the outcome, and that we have shared outcomes. Because that is, I think too often still, the bank and the UN operate in almost different countries, where our legal constraints or legal understandings of the country are different, and we diverge at the outcome level, and we don't sit down and develop a shared understanding. And I think we're getting better at that. I think it would be fantastic to move more towards that direction where we have shared outcomes and shared understandings. And the last one, which comes a bit to the partnerships point, is, I mean, the UN to be the UN, the famous quote about the UN is the UN was never designed to deliver us into heaven. It was designed to save us from hell. The UN is an institution that is set up to take enormous risk, and the day-to-day operations of the UN must not obscure that the UN is sent in to do things that no other actor would be asked to do. And the UN is, I think at its core, very conscious that we can and we are designed to take risks that other actors cannot. And when it comes to the bank, the UN is also there to shoulder risk and move risk onto ourselves that would enable an institution like the World Bank to work at a bigger scale, more effectively in countries. And I think the WDR 2014 was a great addition on the risk. I just wanted one addition that I didn't find in there, and the key point is taking risks is necessary to pursue opportunities for development. The flip side is active investment is really fundamental to reduce risks. In many countries we're working today, we are managing very, very negative risks. South Sudan, to mention a case, and we're trying to move that process forward. We're not at the point yet, I think, where we're going to be able to achieve hugely positive outcomes. Let me go back to that in the questions, that's a bit loaded. Just on the partnership, I've mentioned the partnership, and I think there is a sea change. Even in the last sort of year, 2 years, you're beginning to see, in the position I work in, I get to see from the speeches to the background conversations and the email traffic at senior down to more lower levels, and there is a sea change. And in fact, the DSG sent the Deputy Secretary General sent an email after the first day of the Fragility Forum, and he said, I believe I'm seeing a significant change in the way the UN and the World Bank want to work together. And he used the word want. It was a very interesting correspondence. That was to his senior management. There are transaction costs. The reason being is because member states put transaction costs in there, frankly. And this is, the UN and the World Bank were designed together, born at the hip out of Washington, actually. And if you look, there's nowhere in that design where there's a telephone number or telephone line that connects the UN and the World Bank. And the reason being is because that telephone line are the member states. Your executive directors are member states. We need, removing the transaction costs requires some nasty work at the coalface. But we need to put the work in because we're going to end up in the same space regardless. We're going to end up in the Middle East together. We're going to end up dealing with the Horn of Africa together. We are going to feel increasing pressure because that's where the development needs are. That's where our member states and executive directors want us to be. And that's where, as multilateral global institutions with our mandates, that is where we're destined to be at this point in time. So we will end up there. And the more we can do to sort of reduce those transaction costs, also with assumptions about positivity and goodwill, whilst we also look at the operational problems, I think the further we can go. But I think there is a significant change. I'll stop there.
And I'll take the message about transaction costs and member states back to Paris. Julian, you're the head of advocacy for International Alert. You've been working quite intensively with the World Bank on these issues of conflict sensitivity. Your role today focuses on shaping and influencing global policy and the global policy agenda related to international responses to fragile and conflict-affected states. So these sea changes are, I can imagine, important for you. Diego was saying that the World Bank needs to take more risk, including in order to manage the risks. Should the bank be bolder in leveraging its influence on key conflict issues? What do you think could be some of the low-hanging fruits that haven't been seized within the World Bank's comfort zone? And is there more to do without changing the walls, pushing the walls? And what do you see as areas for adaptation? I know that the International Alert has been doing work on some of the bank's programs in Uganda, for example. What's your take?
Right. Thanks very much for that, Olivia. I was discussing the remarks I'm about to give over lunch, and I was chatting to colleagues, and it sort of occurred to me I probably could have called the presentation stating the blindingly obvious. But I would hope that following the presentation you don't go out of here saying, I've heard this all before. I hope you come out saying, I want to go and do something about this, and I will do something about this. So for me, it's reinforcing what we know, but emphasising that we need to take action. And I think from what we've heard from the other speakers this afternoon, we do have options. We do have ways of working that can enhance the way that the bank and we as an international community more broadly work in fragile and conflict-affected states. So to kick off, we think that one of the major challenges to improving the bank's work within FCAS is this definition of what success actually looks like. Now, we've got some great examples of where the bank is doing well. However, there are many other cases where success is still measured in terms of portfolio size, disbursement, certainly on an individual level as bank officials. These inputs rather than necessarily social and development outcomes. And from this flows very powerful internal incentives that shape how the bank operates in a variety of different contexts, but which carries particular risk in fragile states. So I think the major message that I want to put forward, to reiterate again, is that this really needs to change. Senior bank staff need to be held accountable for the type of outcomes that are actually needed for transformation in these particular contexts, but they also need the right tools and the flexibility to actually get there. Some of this flexibility comes with being more politically attuned and agile, building political economy considerations into bank projects and design and moving beyond the analysis that it's increasingly integrated into. It's also thinking about and doing more to shape politics and power positively, which could also improve the impact. I think in a number of countries, we still tend to reflect a state-centric, state-driven approach, but I hope that over time that is changing. Even if we look at the CPIA and the factors that it takes into consideration, it is very institutional, state institution-centric. So in terms of some of the assumptions that I think are well known to all of us in the room, but still persist, they're underneath the surface in a lot of what goes on in the multilateral development bank space. I'll run through a few of them and then look at some core recommendations around moving forward. The first is a job creation equals peace. Now, I think everyone has heard various sessions this week that that's not the case. Peace and security, it's about much more than economics. It's about people's power relative to one another. Alert's research in a number of different countries has actually shown that while unemployment can be a driver of conflict, it's usually the case when it's combined with political and social exclusion as well. And we think that's why the boosting security and justice, including social justice, came hand in hand with looking at jobs within the WDR 2011. I think a second assumption that is out there is strengthening state capacity equals stability. There is too little state, this concept of ungoverned space. However, we do know in conflict-affected countries that states can be both corrupt and predatory. They can actually be actively feeding instability. And growing and empowering these states without addressing impunity and patronage usually does more harm than good. Police forces, for example, in some conflict-affected states, trained, given gleaming new white Land Rovers, fantastic buildings, yet remain highly predatory forces. I remember a long time ago, and I can't remember the country context, but someone was telling me that in this particular country, these officials were incredibly excited to get public financial management training. They said, yes, I want that technical assistance, because they were extremely interested in how they could actually better fleece the financial management systems. So basic tools that the international community has been using for a long time and is nevertheless fundamentally important in these contexts need to be looked at in a certain light. And the final one is macroeconomic growth equals development for all. And I think the SDGs are certainly moving us away from that conception to something more around inclusive growth. Nevertheless, this trickle-down approach to economics still infuses some, and I stress some, of the bank's strategies and programming. In places, again, where there's widespread inequality and patrimony, this only reinforces asymmetries and grievances that fuel conflict. So these are some of the basic persistent challenges. And as I said, they shouldn't be news to anyone sitting in the room. But what can we actually do about this? How can we work smarter as institutions? 2 minutes, almost there. So how do we go about this? I think there's a real opportunity to harness community-driven development for stronger social accountability. Alert's latest research, and we have copies of the report at the back of the room, on bank-funded social safety nets projects in Uganda showed that infusing in its second phase this project with a transparency and accountability component actually improved citizen-state relations and community capacity to resolve conflict and also to shape government decision-making beyond the project. I'd also say, and I think this echoes some of the other panellists' comments, that there's a need to increase flexible funding as well. If designed well, trust funds can enable flexible strategic partnerships needed to address various sensitive issues. And I think there needs to be a reinvestment in the State Building and Peace Building Fund, but also a broadening of the range of countries it can be applied to. And similarly, we need a significantly increased investment in the UN World Bank Trust Fund as well as a vehicle to... You agree?
That's a very insightful point.
As a vehicle to we have. So moving along. So I wanted to come back to some more of these, as a final note, to these internal incentives issues. I think that addressing the political economy challenges directly within banks' strategies and then translating those in the way that Debbie has described into action on the ground is absolutely key. It's starting to happen in MENA. It's been done in DRC. We need to see that across the board. And partnerships are obviously a part of developing that understanding of political economy and then driving forward action upon it. I think ultimately, though, the bank must reconsider this concept of what it means to succeed in these environments, and that the right incentives are created for both country directors and staff across the bank to understand what we're actually trying to achieve in these particular environments. I think Liz has summarised the key point quite nicely in this very last remark, and she says that the bank's focus for the new SDG era needs to be people, politics, power and peace, in practice as well as in theory, as much as institutions, growth and jobs. Enabling development depends on getting all of these dimensions right.
Thank you very much. Very, very useful. And I think we have a good understanding of where the World Bank and its partner institutions are going with respect to dealing with politics, dealing with underlying assumptions of how we work. We're now starting the Q&A session. There's one mic if you can queue up behind if you have questions. We didn't want to have a headquarters only discussion. And so we have two colleagues in the room who work for the World Bank and who have field experience, who can share insight about how that translates practically in the DRC, in the MENA region, in Ukraine, in Mali. Hugo, you have significant experience working for the World Bank in the DRC. Ultimately, TTLs are expected to deliver projects, right? They're evaluated on their disbursement rates. And so how much time can World Bank colleagues spend analyzing context when the incentive structure is very strongly skewed towards managing projects? And does that drive for disbursement prevent the teams to take the necessary time to analyze and change the project as the context evolves?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I just took a couple of notes during the meeting. I'll keep it very short. Just very quickly, I work with a number of projects in Congo and Burundi. It's a large portfolio. We have a Great Lakes Initiative. It's $1.5 billion, large projects for agriculture, cross-border trade, community-driven early recovery, etc. I think the issue, to answer your question, I think the issue is not so much time. It has more to do with a bit more of a human factor in a way, which is that if you're a TTL, very often you manage 10, 12 different projects. You're under an enormous amount of pressure to to get your things done, to pass it through the various checkpoints, the QERs, the PAD discussions, etc. My personal experience, and I've been quite lucky in the TTLs I've been working with, and I've been quite lucky in the context as well. Like, first of all, it's quite easy to make a case for conflict prevention in an area like Congo because it's so bloody obvious in a way, right? It's probably a lot harder in middle-income countries where the relationship with the government is quite different as well, where you have a bit more of an equal relationship. You're talking about loans instead of grants, etc. Even so, what I've usually found is that once you start engaging with a project, the initial demand from TTLs is that it needs to be something that helps them implement the project and creates like a permissible environment for it, rather than it being the project. So one of the issues, and that takes a bit of time, is to move it from conflict prevention or doing no harm to actual conflict transformation, which is something fundamentally different. Now, to do that, you need something that, and Alex mentioned this, we don't always have in the bank, which is really in-depth country-specific knowledge. Ideally, you have people that actually spend a few years in that country, who know the partners, who know some of the issues. The most important thing TTLs will ask you, and that takes a lot of time to answer that, is they want you to translate all these great frameworks we have into something concrete for their project. If you have 10 different projects, you don't have time to read all this kind of work. What you want is someone to come with you on mission to help you design a budget and indicators, write parts of the PAD for you, the project document, sorry, and translate that for you. And we are not yet always capable of doing that. And that costs time. Once you have that done, though, another issue, and I found this, we're working on a big agriculture project in Congo, is that if you do agriculture in Eastern DRC, for example, it's an extremely complex environment, right? All the conflicts are related to land, to identity, all these things. You can't go in and do regular value chains. We developed a project that had 5 different components. Value chains, it had a land component, conflict prevention. Higher echelons in the bank are very hesitant to what they consider to be too complex projects. There's still a bit of an idea that an extremely complex environment requires simple projects, or at least simply designed projects. That's usually quite a discussion as well that adds a lot of time to this discussion. And finally, in some of these contexts, it's very hard to find locally good partners to do this work for you, to do political economy analyses, to implement projects in an equitable way between the communities, because very often government counterparts have their own ethnic interests as well. Finding those partners, building their capacity, etc., takes time as well. So just to give you a bit of an idea, it's not just the spending incentive, if you want. It's very much a bit the human factor behind setting up a project like this and all the steps to get there. Maybe just one final point about UN World Bank collaboration. What we've done in Congo is align all the projects under the I4S, the International Stabilization Strategy for the East, which is coordinated by MONUSCO's stabilization unit. And that way we have a bit of an aggregate impact together with all the other UN programs. The big problem, though, is that political dialogue in Congo is extremely hard, even for the UN. So at the moment it functions a bit more on a project sort of level than at the political dialogue. So just a few points. Thanks.
Thank you. Asbjørn, you're a senior specialist within the FCV unit, but you've been working for a long time in Ukraine, Mali, and now in the MENA region. There are a number of tools, instruments that have been designed to help task team leaders do a better job in these contexts. We've heard about earlier in the week conflict filters, fragility assessments, obviously. Does the mandatory, and we heard in the panel that the incentive structure needed to be adapted for these methods and tools to be actually used. Is the incentive structure right? And would the mandatory use of some of these tools be necessary for the bank to actually do that shift if everybody doesn't do it spontaneously? Or are there negative side effects to that? That was one of the questions that was evoked in an earlier session.
Yeah, no, that's difficult to answer it very quickly. But I think, I mean, there's a difference somehow, I've seen at least, and I've been lucky to work in every single region of the bank over the last 3 years. And there's a it's a big difference between the what to do and how we do things, right? On the what side, I think we're getting pretty good. I mean, we're doing now fragility assessments on a regular basis. It's been integrated into the IDA framework in a way that every single fragile state needs to have one of these as input into their strategy. We're doing them more and more in middle-income countries as well. We're doing them jointly with other partners so that we can actually say things in a much stronger way and sometimes hide behind others if we need to pass certain messages. I think there we're making progress, and I think we've seen that these fragility assessments have had a tremendous impact on the country strategies. And in a country like Mali, for instance, we were able to shift focus in the portfolio towards more clearly taking on the decentralization dynamics, which is at the core of the repeated crisis in the north. In other countries, we've been able to kind of talk more firmly about risks, helping country teams to understand risks and how risks evolve at the political level, using specific tools. So I think on the what side we're making progress. It's not perfect, but there is that recognition that these are important tools, these are important dynamics to understand. On the how side, I think it's still much more of a mixed picture, right? And there's a big difference between a country like Somalia or a country where you have a conflict that the bank is engaging with from the outset, where you get that sort of expertise in from the beginning, and comparing that with a place like Mali, or I think most of the MENA countries where the standard operating procedures in the past have been very different, where engagement with government have been very different, the dialogue with government has been very different, and where the sort of shift in mindset at every single level of the institution, as well as in terms of how we engage with our government counterparts, is not done overnight, right? I mean, you need to work on those changes. Some of it is kind of natural changes in staff leaving and new staff coming in with a different set of expertise, but that's not done overnight. And I think we're in many countries we're still struggling a little bit with that kind of mix. But I do think at the end of the day that it's and I wanted to. In Myanmar, we worked a lot on this conflict adaptation issue, and you have 17 different conflicts in the border areas, each with its very different dynamics. You have a unity national government that's in many places never been present, where you have ethnic armed groups that are delivering services that have a certain degree of legitimacy that the national government wouldn't necessarily have. So how does the bank come in very quickly with a huge portfolio? We've gone from 0 to more than 2 billion over the course of 4 years, right? So the portfolio has increased a lot. How do you engage in that difficult situation? How do we move into these areas? What kind of adaptation do we need in our different projects? And there, I think these tools that you were referencing are actually having a tremendous impact, right? Because it comes not only with the analytical piece that allows task team leaders to step out of their day-to-day sectoral work and think a little bit about the big picture and be challenged by experts from outside the bank that can go and tell them why it's important to keep in mind that there are elections coming up, why the fact that there are peace talks going on means you need to think about how you engage with certain groups at certain points in time. But it also comes with this sort of technical assistance so that the TTLs can then, once they've been challenged a little bit at that level, they can actually get help if they need additional research done, if they need additional safeguard specialists on their team to try and figure out what the implications are for the project, et cetera. And I think that is, it does actually have an impact. But my experience is that as with, and I'll stop here, I mean, the cultural challenge in the bank is somehow that a lot of these things cannot be quantified using data, and so we tend to disregard them, right? And that is a big challenge for us. In Mali, we had this huge challenge, and Alexandre was referencing it, that a large part of the team before the conflict started in 2012 were saying, well, 90% of the poor live in the south, so we will focus on the south. And it took the rebellion almost making it to Bamako before that thinking was challenged, right? Perceptions matter. Oftentimes perceptions might not match the facts, but they matter as much or even more in cases where, as Diego was referencing, that violence is a key tool for power, right?
Thank you very much, Asbjørn. Very, very useful. The floor is open to questions. We'll take several in a row. And please, if you can go to the mic, it's the best way because this one isn't very easy to move. If you can just say where you're speaking from, who you are.
My name is Daniel Serwer. I'm professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS, director of the Conflict Management Program. I have a question for Deborah Wetzel. Context matters. So I want to take you to a specific context, namely Egypt, where the bank is spending a lot of money. This is a government today that is making some important economic reforms that have impacts on the poor. And I'm sure you're doing the right things by that. But it's also a government which is excluding a large percentage of the population from political participation. So how do you square it?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Geoffroy Groslo. I'm with the International Rescue Committee. And I'd like to come back on flexibility and that theme that seems to come a lot. I mean, I find very interesting the various discussion we've had over the last few days about politics, the PEA, and how to think about addressing the issue it raised when you actually want to reduce conflict and build a state. But I think there's also quite a dichotomy between those discussions and how programs are actually implemented by the bank and a number of other donors. And I'd like to come back actually on a very specific example on Myanmar. And CDD there, the CDD project works through the state to develop basic infrastructure, like CDD approach, but it works through the state in areas where the government is a party to the conflict. And they've rolled out across the whole country, working with the ministry, Rural Development Ministry, to implement the project. So getting back to the flexibility, what it tells you is that fixing a framework for implementation before you set out the parameters, we apply to implement projects, but we have no flexibility to address the political economy, to weave that and look at what's the particular conflict context. So rolling out across the board, inception stage, midterm reviews, fixing the project on outcomes, but looking at the different pathways and being more flexible. Otherwise, it's not possible to address these issues. And I think people need to think long and hard about the nice big policies and concepts and how it actually applies at the project level.
I think flexibility is a key issue in translating all of this, all of these objectives. Thank you. Yes?
Hi. Great panel. Erin McCandless from the New School, and I'm also quite engaged in the New Deal process on behalf of civil society. And a couple of questions. First, I mean, it's so wonderful to see the changes happening in the bank after so long. I worked in Liberia where we were trying to build the notion of conflict sensitivity in the peacekeeping mission and with the World Bank and the UN at the time, and it wasn't a very popular concept. This was in 2007. So two questions. One is this notion of process, right? We know that with fragility assessments in particular, and this is, of course, being led by the G7+ and through the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building, that fragility assessments and conflict assessments are best when they are engaging and built upon, the stakeholders themselves, not by international experts coming in and doing a quick assessment. So how and, in what ways is the bank going to move in that direction, or are you already moving in that direction? Because, of course, a lot of building ownership and is about political will, right, to engage and to implement an understanding of the conflict analysis and directing that into policy. The other question for everybody, it's just, I think, a challenge we have as we build an evidence base around certain theories of change. There's a desire to want to implement them around the world. Even the Agenda 2030 has, a particular theory of change, and I still think it actually needs to be tested in terms of peace-building results in different contexts. So I'm wondering how we balance being context sensitive and having these, amazing theories of change. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Two more questions, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Thanks. Mark Robinson, heading governance at the World Resources Institute. but wearing an earlier hat from DFID. And Alexandra, you raised a really interesting point about the fact that we haven't really got a very effective narrative or set of operational responses to address the problem of legitimacy. And I think we do need to tackle that one very centrally, because it was, of course, featured both in the WR 2011 as well as DFID's earlier policy paper a year or two before that on building peaceful and stable states. The question I want to raise is there potentially a joint agenda that speaks substantively to how the bank and the UN agencies work together in fragile states, particularly post-conflict, around what we would have called durable and inclusive political settlements? Not a language we've heard much about today on the panel. It's popped up here and there. DFID put it very much at the heart of its own framework. The bank didn't, partly for the reasons that Alexandra suggested, but some of the substance was there, i.e. what is it that needs to be done to achieve long-term durable peace through bringing together warring factions across the table who are willing to govern effectively for the majority of citizens. I think that remains elusive. I think we have some examples of how through peace-building efforts that's been achieved. What I would argue is that we need to actually adopt a developmental approach to achieving durable and inclusive political settlements. And that requires both work by the bank and bilaterals as well as the UN agencies. The UN, of course, is incredibly well equipped to address the political inclusivity dimensions of political settlements in a way that many of the bilaterals can't. But the bank, of course, is so well equipped to address the legitimacy aspects of this. And so often I think we thought it was all about jobs and creating services that were necessary for large numbers of poor, dispossessed and displaced people. That may be true. The evidence, of course, hasn't always demonstrated that we have a very clear link between investments like that and building long-term legitimacy. So the question is, what is required to build long-term legitimacy behind a sustainable political settlement that both addresses some of the underlying economic challenges as well as the political ones? So, and I think here lastly, it raises the question of tackling sources of illegitimacy and the problem of corruption and venality in post-conflict non-inclusive political settlements. So some suggestions about pieces of an agenda that we're all grappling at but haven't joined up fully or convincingly yet. Thanks.
Thank you. One more question, and then we'll give the panel a chance to answer.
Great, thank you. My name is Alan Hudson. I work with Global Integrity, a small non-profit based in DC that focuses on governance diagnostics. I previously worked for DFID as a governance advisor. I come at this very much kind of from a mainstream governance perspective and from an organisation that is very focused on kind of open governance and the open government partnership and things like that. And this is a comment rather than the question. I'm just really excited by what the fragility folks bring to the table on this. I think the kind of discussions from people who've been engaged in conflict-affected and fragile states have a real potential to really sharpen the broader governance agenda and to sharpen the broader open governance agenda. I think your emphasis, I mean, I include myself in the group as well, but the emphasis from folks working on fragility, the emphasis on legitimacy, the emphasis on politics, the emphasis on adaptive programming and learning is really, really key and really puts the fragility folks at the forefront of the governance agenda. So I'm just excited and very much looking forward to seeing how this sort of conversation shapes the broader governance agenda, including the open governance agenda. And so, for instance, Will talking about the kind of shift in role and position of Chase within DFID. I mean, yes, that's really important for work on fragility, but also it has the potential to really sharpen the governance agenda more broadly within DFID, and the same might apply to other donors. That was all.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes. What I suggest is that panelists take the questions that they want to answer most. Debbie, I'd like to give you a chance to answer the question about how we square the politics in Egypt. And beyond this, the different questions that relate to how does that translate operationally in the MENA region.
Okay, so thanks for the question. I'm a SAIS graduate, 86, so it's been a little while, but just a little advertising for SAIS. I've been through many regions and topics since then, but so Egypt, it's a dilemma, right? And so there's been a lot of movement, a lot of changes in government. We are working very carefully to try to identify ways in which we can advance economic reforms that are good for citizens and people, and to try to insert transparency, openness, citizen feedback into delivery of services and other such things. These governments are always moving, right? And they start one place and they shift to another. And the movement may have not been, as we do something at one point in the year and then we see how things evolve, it may, they may go in directions that are not exactly where we thought they would go. I think, so we try to work with them to promote these ideals that we're looking for. If we see things go too far, then we pull back. So for example, we had a discussion we have underway, waiting at the moment, a very large DPL, policy-based operation. It hasn't dispersed yet because we're waiting to see a few things that we had discussed with the government, and those things haven't been accomplished yet. And we have in the unit, it's a high-end discussion that we're talking about in the region, is how do we make sure we're not on the wrong side of history again? And the problem is knowing what the wrong side of history is going to be. And at any given snapshot, and that's not a quote for the press to say, World Bank on wrong side of history, please don't. But we're mindful of the issues that you raise. And so, again, as we're implementing our programs and our strategy, we're really trying, on an analytical perspective, we're trying to look at these issues of vested interests. How are they shaping the economy? How are they dominating the economy in a way that affects the ability to promote economic and social progress and inclusion that undermines where we're trying to go over time? So let me leave it at that, and then if there's other thing, I can go back on some of the other questions if you want me to when you get to those.
Let's jump to Alex. There was a question on participation by the stakeholders to the analysis of their own dynamics. Is that a way that the World Bank wants to take? And perhaps the other questions on legitimacy, if you had things to add.
So on the fragility assessment, I think that's a very, very good point. I think there's one thing I think where we've done a lot of progress in the bank over the last 3 years, and we've pushed considerably in that, is on the systematic use of fragility assessments, right? And we've worked with our GPSUR, I mean the social development colleagues on that, and we've produced guidelines. But now, from 4 years ago, we had done 2 free conflict analysis, 4 conflict analysis. Since then, we have about 35 of them. And we've integrating them in our new SCD whenever possible. And we have done that. Lebanon is one of a very successful case, I think, of integration. We are doing them now collectively with some other donors. So we've started with AFD. We've just came back from Tunisia, and we were in Cameroon. We're also doing them outside of pure fragile countries. Country in the list. We've done them with the UN. We're trying to do more in CR. We'll have 3 other people coming with us, the UN, the FAID, and AFD. So we're really progressing. Where we're not managing to progress is really put it on the table. And we're actually consulting a lot the civil society. Consultation, that's a big part of it. In terms of content, not just are you pleased with it, but what should we bring in? Where we are very limited is to put it on the table to the government for a discussion with the government. And that's where it's very, very difficult. And I think that's ultimately what is going to be done if we want to do it. Now, there are things, of course, that you don't put on table of government when you are, for example, putting names of some ministers or others on not very nice things. So that you can take off. So the Madagascar team, for example, had 2. Had 1 for our internal needs, plus 1 for the government discussion, where all the big policy issues were maintained. for policy discussion. Of course, the one where the government was very eager was like the one of Ivory Coast 2 years ago, because we're all saying very good thing about the government, or Guinea-Bissau recently, right? But I think that remains a very difficult thing that many country directors just don't feel at ease to put it on the table with the government yet. But if we really want to move one point more, we will need to do that. So that's, I think, a very crucial issue that you have raised. On the legitimacy, I think that's a very big issue, and I agree with many of the issue that have been mentioned. What I think we need is to look more at operation. I'm turning to Debbie here because that's going to be a lot on your agenda. Is how do you approach this issue? And also agree. I mean, this idea that you just create legitimacy by suddenly having more effective delivery, that's a very theoretical issue, right? It's true in some cases, true in not other cases. There are many other things that comes in legitimacy. Sometimes government can be legitimate by delivering terrible services because there's something else. They come from a rebellion, they freed the country, they have the right ideology, and that plays on much better than actually the good delivery of services. So we have to be really careful about that. It's something we need to work on.
Thank you. Jago, do you want to, what are the questions you want to pick up on? Perhaps on how do we test theories of change?
No.
That's not the one you want to comment on.
And this morning I shared with a bank colleague, I said, this is what the nature of the panel is, and I worked and I developed some points. And she said, what's it about? I said, I'm going to talk about the World Bank's theories of change. And she said, whatever you do, do not do that. Do not talk about the World Bank's theories of change, and don't make them do that either. So I won't, no. I want to pick up this point about legitimacy again and the partnership, and just quickly. This is exactly, I think, this point about horizontal strategies. You can have the most developed sectoral or vertical strategies in the world, and you will deliver the best job or the best water supply or the best peacekeeping is a bad example, or the best consultation process, CDD process in the world, and you will not get a stable settlement, you will not get a legitimate settlement. A legitimate, and I like the idea that you must take a developmental approach. We start with a piece of paper, we start with the negotiations, and we start with an inclusive, an elite bargain in almost all cases. And that elite bargain will only last and will only be sustained if that broadens out over time. If over time, over 20, 30 years, what you're doing on the sort of WDR spiral is you're enlarging that political settlement. And that enlargement process very rapidly moves beyond the political realm. It's just not feasible. In a more technical way, what you're doing is you're moving from an extra parliamentary political process, and then you move it into the national political scene. You build it into institutions. And that is a parliamentary process, that's an executive process. It's developmental, but it only comes together with that objective if you have horizontal strategies. And the problem with horizontal strategies is that if we ever do them by ourselves, they're too small. This is the point about the I4S. Anybody with their own little individual horizontal strategy, their area-based program, the scale in fragile countries that's required is so big, and I mean money, frankly, many cases, that by ourselves we can't get there. We need to work with the peacekeeping missions, we need to work with the development banks, with civil society partners and the government to try and lift these strategies up to the point where they make an impact on people's lives at a macro level. And that's a transition. That takes time. So I think I agree. I would think we need to put this sort of political settlement ideas back in the center, and this sort of enlarging process is a key piece. One last very practical point. This is a 20, 30-year process, and the finance ODA is never going to be enough. ODA is a pittance in this process. And one of the key parts of the conversation with the bank is we talk about operations sometimes, that if we take the whole trajectory of 20, 30 years, the government of Somalia has its stabilization strategy. Without access to concessional financing, that will never become a national reality. It will exist only on a piece of paper or bit-piece projects here and there. And what we need is to look at these strategies over 20, 30 years and work out how we transfer responsibility almost from one to the other, or help support the government in these one to the other. And specifically, I'm thinking about peacekeeping, because governments, a successful, peaceful political transition is often punished financially, in that you lose the ODA, you lose the humanitarian support, you lose the political attention, and then you're sort of, well, thank you, and you get given the baton and asked to carry it forward. Without necessarily the resourcing or technical assistance, and probably more the technical assistance to make it work. And one of the things that would be great to discuss with the bank is sort of, let's look at these 20, 30-year processes and move beyond the sort of specific projects, but look at the Liberias of the world and say, well, what do we do next to get to this next 10 years of the post-peace transition with the enlarging political settlement idea in mind?
Thank you. Julian, what do you take away from this discussion? Both the panels and the questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the unsaid thing so far has been the role of the executive director's offices. At the end of the day, the bank and all the bank staff need political coverage to actually advance this particular agenda. Now, IDA 18 is part of the story, but it's not the total picture. You know, there are a lot of countries that fall outside of the IDA construct, and so there's a need for much broader change. So that's not going to be the only vehicle. But I think that the executive director's offices really need to step up, as do the IDA deputies, to think through how we can come up with a deliberate approach to make this practice consistent across the bank.
Will, DFID has been pushing the World Bank to move in that direction. You've said in your introductory remarks that you're going to be pushing some more because of the importance of this agenda and the importance for this agenda to go deeper in the institution than just at the ED level or vice president level. Do you think that after this discussion we're moving in the right direction, and how can we move faster?
Yeah, I do. There are a couple of things that I wrote down that I wanted to mention, and then all the questions were about the things I'd written down, so that was quite helpful. But I wanted to pick up the point about flexible programming because it's the kind of problem that has some quite practical solutions, which is quite nice. It's not a 20, 30-year problem. It's the kind of thing that we can have a conversation about how to do differently and how to do better and be done by Christmas. But that's something that we've been struggling with in DFID quite a lot for the last couple of years, and I think we're really making progress on it. And if we can share that conversation more with the bank, I think that'd be really useful. It's really important for the conversation about context and about analysis, because we can commission and do all the analysis in the world, but if the next decision point is 5 years down the line, then we're wasting our time. And we have made some progress with this just by saying things like, it's okay to design programs where if part of it fails, that is not writing off the whole thing, and we can learn from that and build that back into the rest of the program. It's okay for people to take decisions about how to achieve outcomes that change as we go along, and we don't always have to go back to ministers for decisions on that. We can say, yes, we're going to achieve the aims of this program, and we are taking decisions based on analysis about what that means in practice. And there is lots of good practice out there on this, and it's a really kind of profitable conversation to have. There were some really useful points about identifying outcomes and then coming together around outcomes. And I think this is something that's been running through quite a lot of conversations this week, and it's something where getting the language right is really important, and where it does pay to spend a bit of time making sure that we agree on the things within theories of change, if you like, which are likely to be most useful. So, for example, it was really clear in a conversation earlier in the week that talking about outcomes in terms of state building is not going to be the way to bring together humanitarian and development communities. Talking about outcomes in terms of political settlements is actually really problematic when we mean different things by that. So, you know, I'm not always the most unequivocal cheerleader for the New Deal, but it is really helpful in having a set of things which have been bought into by quite a wide constituency, and where we can think about strengthening some of those and having conversations about theories of change which work from that. And then finally, just on legitimacy, absolutely still very much at the heart of how we see the kind of the whole issue around stability within DFID. Absolutely dependent on context about what that means, but at least we could start by asking those questions in places where we're working. We don't need to have a theory of change that works everywhere in the same way, but we do know there are some questions that it's really useful to ask in places where we're working. And if one of those is about what are the expectations of people of the state or the institutions or the types of authority at whatever level in places, and how far are the interventions that we're designing helping to meet those expectations and build confidence in those. That's the kind of question which it might be really helpful to take as a starting point rather than just a blanket assumption about what the impact of our work is going to have.
Thank you. It's 3 p.m. If we can all join me in thanking the panelists for this excellent discussion. Thank you very much.
Sorry?